there you go. I'll do my best to give a performance. This is a paper that I actually wrote in honor of Professor Andrea Durbach, who's a human rights lawyer based at Sydney University. And she's South African originally, and has inspired me in the last couple of years with her work on transformative gender justice, transitional justice, reparations, and so on, specifically looking at South Africa. And then she also did a piece of work on sexual harassment in universities a couple of years ago. And that's where we connected, and because I wanted to do the same in my university. So I guess that is relevant because we both find that connection between different forms of gender-based violence really important, and not to separate different gender-based violences. And of course, harassment in university in Australia or in the UK or in the Netherlands is completely different in nature, in scale, and so on, from conflict-related sexual violence in the Peruvian Andes. And nevertheless, we need to think about the connections around inequality, gender inequality, race, and so on. So the paper will come out in the Australian Journal of Human Rights this autumn, as part of that collection for Professor Durbach. The idea of transformative gender justice is important in thinking through transitional justice as well. Because transformative gender justice, the way Andy Durbach has used it and the way I have used it in previous work, it suggests that transitional justice tools, transitional justice we mean truth-seeking, truth commissions, criminal justice via prosecutions, accountability, and reparations. And that these tools need to unsettle the inequalities that are the basis of political violence. Yeah? So the transformative gender justice refers to this idea that these tools of truth, accountability, and repair need to not only repair what went wrong, but something bigger, something long-term, something more structural. And in the case of gender justice, this is really important because of high levels of post-conflict gender-based violence in most post-conflict countries. We see it in post-apartheid South Africa, we see it in Colombia, we see it in Peru, in Guatemala, and in Bosnia, and you see it in most post-conflict countries that gender-based violence is very high. So the idea of transformative justice is also asking transitional justice activists to take into account this, to use that transition to push for more transformative and structural change for gender equality. So it is a term that allows us to interrogate how the tools and mechanisms of transitional justice are deployed. No? So if we look with a transformative perspective on truth commission, we need to ask who is being heard, what is being told, what can be told. No? And this is the most, still I think, the most famous book, the most cited book about gender in truth commissions is Fiona Ross' 2003 Bearing Witness in South Africa. So that is about truth. And then, and truth reverberates into memory, of course. What kind of narratives, historical narratives, countries create about political violence in the past. And this is the new book. So I'm also doing a pitch for the new book. And helpfully there's a code if you want to buy it and you want it cheaper, then you can use the code to order it for 20% off. So this is not about Latin America only. It has a couple of case studies from Latin America, including Brazil, Peru, and another one, Guatemala maybe. I think it's only Brazil and Peru. And then there's a couple of African country case studies as well, and South Korea as well. So really looking comparatively at thinking, okay, so in that memory work, museums, commemorative plaques, naming of streets, etc., in post-conflict context, again, who's being heard, who's being visibilized, which stories are sort of picked up on and which are not, and which ways of commemorating unsettled gender stereotypes or affirm gender stereotypes. No, a lot of commemoration actually affirms stereotypes that are negative and harmful. Then reparations, of course, and still the most important book with regards to gender and reparations is this book by Ruth Rubio Marin, The Gender of Reparations, about which violences and which harms are being recognized and hence get reparations. No? So a lot of these sort of post-conflict transitional justice processes include literally financial packages of reparations, but also funding for education and all kinds of packages of reparations. And again, the question is, who has access to these reparations and what kind of harms are being recognized as repairable? No? And the question of sexual violence is an obvious question there, of who gets repaired or not. And lastly, of course, is criminal justice. So criminal justice is the other pillar of transitional justice. So accountability, who is responsible, who and why and how can you account for certain atrocities that have been committed in during political violence, no? Now, in relation to gender-based harms and gender-based violence, which is my main interest here, there has been quite a lot of interest in prosecuting for sexual violence in conflict since the tribunals in former Yugoslavia and Rwanda in the 1990s. There were these mixed international tribunals where international prosecutors developed the jurisprudence for being able to prosecute sexual violence as a crime against humanity. Yeah? So this is not the same as you go to court here in peacetime with a case of rape or harassment. This is sexual violence as a crime against humanity, or sexual violence as a war crime or as genocide. In the cases that I'm going to talk about, Guatemala and Peru, we're talking about sexual violence as a crime against humanity, not as war crimes, which is a different category, nor as genocide, which is still a different category. So I'm going to talk about Guatemala and Peru because these are the only countries up till now who are prosecuting, and Colombia is working on that as well, to prosecute sexual violence in conflict-related, so historical sexual violence as a crime against humanity. And that means that it needs to be proven to have been systematic. No? Otherwise, it might be a war crime if it's an individual instance. But in these instances, it's about systematic violation. Now, Guatemala, both countries have had very complicated political conflicts, political violence. I'm not going to explain the violence itself either. Most of you will know a little bit of what happens in these countries. What is relevant to say is that in both countries, it were largely the armed forces, i.e. the counterinsurgency, that used sexual violence against local indigenous populations as a way to intimidate and terrorize that population. Yeah. And that falls within that definition of a crime against humanity. There's also a lot of opportunism, of course, so explaining sexual violence, which is not necessarily the goal in this talk, but I'm also interested in that. As one of the books that is going around is specifically on sexual violence in the Peruvian conflict, and we do want to understand why it happens, no? So there is a lot of, or there is some opportunism of soldiers to do things that they normally wouldn't do, but there's also an internal logic in institutions, in military institutions, whereby certain violences are perhaps facilitated not ordered, but facilitated for other purposes. For example, to create a violent and loyal to each other group of soldiers. No? So there are all kinds of logics there of why sexual violence is sometimes, in some conflicts, so very widespread. So these are stories of sexual slavery, forced prostitution, gang rape of girls and women. Most of the research shows that this violence was facilitated by the military hierarchy, even if it's not ordered, but yes, systematically directed at what was often seen as an enemy population or a civilian population in which enemy populations might be hiding. No? So it has that systematic element to it. So, as I said, since the tribunals for Rwanda and former Yugoslavia, there is this international jurisprudence, international human rights law has been developed. But just as in peacetime, in the Netherlands or in the UK or in Peru or in Guatemala, prosecuting sexual violence is really difficult still, no? And rates of convictions are really low here, everywhere. It's just really difficult, as I'm sure you know. So the ICC, the International Criminal Court here in The Hague, which has the responsibility to prosecute war criminals and has done successfully in a couple of cases, has never prosecuted anyone successfully for sexual violence. Although it has all that legislation, no? There are a couple of cases that are positive, that have been able to prosecute for crimes against humanity for sexual violence, but those are all these hybrid tribunals. So there was a tribunal in Sierra Leone, in Chad, in Cambodia, in Bosnia, so the war crimes tribunal in Bosnia is also prosecuting for sexual violence. So these hybrid courts, hybrid meaning a combination of international expertise, legislation, and domestic expertise, domestic judges, prosecutors, lawyers, that combination tends to be more successful. Now, Latin American countries don't really rely on the ICC because in Latin America there is the Inter-American system, the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights and the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. Are there any experts on human rights in the room, or not at all? No. Okay. So the Inter-American system is a fantastic system. It's quite radical in what it does, but it can't prosecute individuals the way the ICC in The Hague can. No, the Inter-American system only investigates. The Commission investigates. It pronounces itself. And it advises the state. So it can prosecute a state, but it can't hold a state to account. You know? So it tells Peru or Guatemala or Mexico, yeah, this is not, you haven't done this right, this is a violation of the human rights of this person or this group of people, and you have to put the perpetrators in prison or you have to pay reparations. And the state then says, huh, I don't care. Huh? Which is what Peru does fairly frequently, to be honest. This means that the role of domestic judiciaries is really important. So the Latin American countries, they don't go to the ICC for various reasons. The Inter-American system can't really hold anyone really to account. It's just its expertise is fantastic and useful, but it doesn't really hold account. So the domestic judiciaries are really important to prosecute violations of human rights. Now, Guatemala established a special court to prosecute human rights violations, which is called a high-risk court, set up in 2009. The high-risk court prosecutes crimes against humanity, violations of human rights, but also high-profile corruption cases or criminal violence cases, for example. Anything that poses a danger to the judiciary, to the judges and prosecutors and lawyers involved, that goes to the high-risk court and then gets extra protection. So it's basically, it's It's a judiciary in a bunker. No, it's extra protection for to protect the case. And it is this court that prosecuted former General Rios Montt, dictator in the 1980s, and it successfully convicted him for genocide in 2013, but under pressure of government, corruption, elites, that conviction was overturned within 10 days or so of the original conviction. So that also says something about what is high risk then. Nevertheless, that case was really important because it does prove that there are judiciaries who are very capable to draw on international law in order to prosecute their own, as it were. Now, Peru did the same. They set up a national criminal court, something similar, also to prosecute solely human rights violations, and then it became that they added other cases, just minor criminal cases to it as well. So these courts slowly become completely overwhelmed, and the international crimes, the crimes against humanity, are pushed out because there's no time. No, this is also a strategy of overwhelming a court so that these cases can't really be successful. At least that's how I see it. No. So this image is of the national court in Peru, and it's the start of the case that I want to talk about in a bit, Manta and Vilca. But before I do so, I want to talk about the Guatemalan case, Sepur Zarco. Anyone heard of this case? No. Okay, Donnie, of course. Yeah. Okay, so Sepur Zarco is a really, really important case, as some of us who, if you work on gender-based violence and particularly in relation to political violence in Latin America, and this was really a landmark case, because it's the first ever and still only case of a domestic court in Latin America who has prosecuted and convicted two ex-manders, military, for crimes against humanity, sexual and domestic slavery against a group of indigenous women. And these are the women who did come to court, but didn't want to be photographed, although if you go Google, then there's plenty of images around, of course. Particularly because the case was successful, that takes away the shame as well. Eh? So this already indicates the importance of accountability and that criminal accountability, that was the question of the paper, can criminal accountability be transformative? The fact that then the veils can come off, the shame is being reversed, as it were, and put on the perpetrators rather than on the victims, is an indication of a really important transformative effect of criminal justice. Now, my analysis of the Sepur Zarco, I haven't done the research myself on this particular case, is largely based on Jo-Marie Burt's work, because she has attended all these cases and continued and attended the Rios Montt case and so on. So she's really the human rights expert on Guatemala. And she highlights three elements that made the Sepur Zarco case particularly transformative. And I'm going to summarize these three elements for you because that will allow me then to look at the Peruvian case, which is similar in nature. It also involves several military perpetrators, ex-soldiers, and a group of women who are prosecuting these ex-military for crimes against humanity, sexual violence. So the cases are in nature very similar. Yeah. Now, the Sepur Zarco case was transformative. It was successful in 2016, if I'm correct. Yeah. And it was successful because of the evidentiary practices, i.e. the way in which it built the case. Yeah? As I said previously, proving sexual violence is extremely difficult. Now, one of the things of international law, that jurisprudence that I talked about earlier in the ICC, the jurisprudence that came out of former Yugoslavia Tribunal and the Rwanda Tribunal, is that you can prove sexual violence in conflict by proving that the context was of a particular nature, i.e. you don't have to prove or corroborate the testimony of the victim survivor. You can take that, you can believe that, and the coercive context is then enough evidence of coercion. And that is really important in this, because a lot of domestic judiciaries, including the Peruvian one, doesn't really care about that and still wants to interrogate women about to what extent they might have consented to sexual relationships, as happens in peacetime as well. So Jo-Marie Burt says, well, but in the Sepur Zarco case, the witness testimony was approached really with a lot of respect, because there was a pre-trial in which the testimonies of these women was recorded. Video recorded, which means that they didn't have to, when the actual trial which was public, public to the wider audience, no. But they didn't have to testify there anymore, no, because they were recorded, and that takes off a lot of pressure of the victim survivors. And it considers the problem of re-traumatization by putting women in a position, or by not putting them in a position to having to testify in front of open court. In addition, they built this context that I said that is so important to, so what is the context in which these events have happened and were possible, you know? So they called not only the women as witnesses, but they called members of the community, men, police officer, one ex-military who was highly protected and had to testify anonymously, of course, and they called expert witnesses. So they called historians, sociologists, anthropologists, forensic scientists, of course, and all that evidence creates then a narrative of itself. So it's creating history. It's almost an additional truth commission, no? But then in criminal court. And that then helps, of course, to create, again, in terms of transformative gender justice, that creates a completely different narrative of what happens in a conflict. You know, if you really allow the victim survivors to speak about their perspective of what has happened, rather than the military and the political elites to control the narrative of conflict-related violence. So that was really important as well. And then this narrative, and then of course the actual conviction of these military, had a consequence for the future, because it allowed for other women to come forward and say, well, and this happened to me when I was detained in 1986, and this happened to me. So there were more reports of conflict-related sexual violence, and they were taken up by the Ministerio Público, by the public prosecutor, to be investigated and tried. And at least one, the Molina Thijssen case, has been successful since then, no? Successfully prosecuted for rape in detention. So again, that is really important for accountability more generally, and for accountability considering Guatemala is one of the most violent countries in Central America, and definitely in Latin America, maybe even in the world, for women, high levels of femicide and so on. These landmark cases are really, really important to start a change in these cases. And lastly, and that is likewise really important, is that this trial, Sepur Zarco, took 2 weeks. So they did lengthy pre-trial investigations, testimonies. You know, they made a watertight case. They built that case over several years, and when it was built, when it was solid, they went to open court, public court, and did it in 2 weeks. Just 2 weeks, long days, that's it. And then there was a conviction, and that's it. Yeah, and that is really has proven really powerful, particularly if we go to the Peruvian case, which is, as Barbara said, where my main interest lies, and which is the case that I'm mainly following as well. The pre-trial, this takes forever and it's still ongoing. There's a session later today still on Zoom. There was a pre-trial justice in Guatemala which took 6 years, but the procedures were opened in 2009. The first public trial started in 2016, took 2 years, and then was cancelled. It was called as, it was annulled because one of the judges had to resign because of corruption charges. Then, and there are 3 judges, yeah, in these cases. One had to resign, and then there were accusations. So the lawyers of the women, of the victim survivors, claimed that the judiciary was not impartial. Yeah. So they sided with the military basically. They were rude to the women. They didn't give them space. They didn't allow. They had to testify in front of the perpetrators. The women wanted the trial to be public because that creates also a certain level of accountability. Yeah, if there are observers, if observers can be present, and if you want observers to be present, then it has to be a public trial. And the judges denied that public trial. So there was the first couple were public. You see in the press and so on, and after that they closed it to the public. And they also wanted to, instead of prosecuting as crime against humanity, they wanted to typify it a common crime. And if it's a common crime, then it becomes a peacetime crime, and then a statute of limitation applies. And as you're not lawyers, statute of limitation means that it's just that a crime for years, it passes. After so many years, you can't prosecute anymore. So these are historical crimes that happened 30 years ago, 40 years ago. No? So if the judge was allowed to say this is a common crime, then the whole case drowns. There's no case. No? They denied the victim survivors psychological support. It was a sham, really. So in the end, the trial was annulled in 2018. New judges were appointed, and the trial started again in 2019. But so this is already 2 years of trial wasted, basically. Yeah, and women had to testify, be interrogated, and all the rest of it. And then they had to start again in 2019. You cannot, you must feel strength for these women. It's amazing that they're continuing, but they're continuing, which is fantastic. But then Corona happened, of course, and the trial restarted in June last year via Zoom. Now, as with all these things, the advantage of that is that international observers can actually attend, you know? Because one of the strategies here, again, if a trial is 2 weeks, then all these observers, national or international, you can go to the trial, you stay next to the court for 2 weeks, and that's it. But if there is a session for 2 hours every 2 weeks, drawn out over 2 years, then the international observers are not there. And a lot of national, local observers will also drop out because it's too much, no, for everyone. So the first criticism that I'm making on the Manta and Vilca case is the duration of the trial. It's also difficult to maintain attention from civil society organizations, from the media, and so on. No? The time also means, so women have to, these are poor indigenous women who live in highland Manta y Vilca in the Peruvian Andes. Yeah, these are farmers, they don't have anything. They would have to travel to Lima to testify, yeah, every 2 weeks from the Andes. Now, okay, so now it's online, on Zoom, so maybe that means that they don't have to travel, but they still have to travel to the provincial town to get access to Wi-Fi, to psychological support. There's an NGO team which supports them, and so on. So it's still a massive effort that they have to make. to keep this going. And of course it prevents closure. No, it's ongoing and ongoing. These are elderly women, and it's not only them, but it's their children and their family and the community and the perpetrators as well. No, it's everybody is just hanging on a thread. This is literally, it's transmitted, the trial is transmitted on Justicia on YouTube, basically. It really is public, so I'm not breaching any guidelines here with the image. Nevertheless, I do call in when there is a session to be able to see what's going on, no? And one of the other things, so apart from the time, the distance, some of the things that were problematic in the first trial continue to be problematic in this trial. For example, the defense lawyers, i.e. the lawyers of the perpetrators, are allowed to ask questions that would definitely not be allowed if proper international law would have been, and guidelines would have been followed. They ask about what women wore in the early 1980s, in the high Andes, poor farmers in a militarized area. It's amazing that is possible. They ask about the sexual relations that the women had in those in that time. They question the sexual relationships that they had with men. They ask about the children that they had and who the fathers are of those children. They question their sincerity in reporting sexual violence by saying, but who put you up to reporting this? That was the NGO, wasn't it? That kind of question. Now, in the end, when this was happening with one particular witness, the judge did intervene, but then the response of the judge was really condescending to the woman, because the woman got angry and said, she got really angry, and she started screaming, this is none of business, why are you going on? This is good for her, because nobody else intervened. And then the judge intervened, but so condescendingly, and told her, well, calm down, mamita, no? And so all of this is really, it's completely contrary to what we saw in Sepur Zarco in the case in Guatemala, no? Lastly, after all those years of trial and repeated testimony, the court has still not called for expert witnesses. No forensic scientists, no sociologists, no anthropologists, no historians. And it's unclear if and when and who they will call. It might still happen, but we don't know yet. And that means that they take the context, as I said before, that creating context is really important for the coercive context to prove the veracity of the testimony. Rather than questioning the testimony itself, you question the context. Yeah? But in this case, the judges allow the defense lawyer to literally interrogate the women in a manner that is really unethical and to be fair, disempowering, re-victimizing. So while criminal justice can be transformative, as we've seen in Guatemala with the Sepur Zarco case, it can also do harm, as we see. This is really difficult to watch, and it doesn't generate any kind of empowerment of the women or of wider society in relation to sexual violence that is prevalent in society. No, it just drags on and on. There might still, of course, be criminal justice. It might still be that soon, or in a couple of years, who knows, that there is a conviction. Then we have criminal justice, at least criminal justice. No? But that's not transformative gender justice. It actually does harm, and what harm it does or what good it does, we have to see afterwards. I can't speculate on that now. Okay, so one of the organizations that supports these women since The Truth Commission ran 2001-2003, so that's the first time that these women talked about what they had lived through in the 1980s. And this is from an organization, Demos, who has supported women from the beginning and provided legal support, but also very much psychosocial support in order to make it possible for these women to testify. And they're campaigning constantly, trying to keep the case in the public eye, keep it, keep the pressure on. And so there are civil society organizations such as these. There is an NGO that does human rights law that is also supporting the women in addition to the prosecutor. So in principle, these cases are from, and the public prosecutor has to do it really, but because of the lack of resources, there are these organizations that sort of back that up. And so apart from this, there's these civil society organizations that try to keep the pressure on. International observers like myself and others write letters to the newspapers, columns to newspapers in order to sort of to demand that to keep the pressure on, but also to highlight what is going wrong in the trial. There is an amicus curiae, a legal term for a friendly brief from the Washington Office of War Crimes, in which it outlines very precisely how the court could use international law to the benefit of the case and of the victim survivors. So this is to say there's even despite the circumstances, the difficult circumstances of this, and the drawn out way of the way time works against this case, there is a lot of engagement with the case, but the judges do not seem to take that into account at all. So to end on there's the last thing that is around this case that is interesting, I think, is arts. So there's a lot of organized feminist organizations, but also poets and writers and filmmakers and theater makers who pick up on particular themes from the political conflict in order to highlight cases, to put them out there. And the case of sexual violence has been portrayed in literature, in theaters, and some with better results than others, or with more transformative effects than others. That's of course also a question. And then there is this one I wanted to show you to close with, and to a certain extent I'm showing these sort of artistic interventions in society, because this is where I think if we can't rely on criminal justice, then at least we need to rely on civil society to intervene and in different ways. You can't force criminal justice, but you can be creative. And so this is a video of, it speaks for itself. Does everybody speak Spanish? Read Spanish? Perhaps? Yeah? Don't know. I'm just, it's in Spanish, but I think it's fine, and even if you don't, then you can follow it more or less. The film is made by Marta Cecilia Dietrich, who's here as well, and it is, well, I'll just see if it works. I can't do it like this, no? Well,
I don't think so. I think you need to open the
wait. This one.
Marta, was this the one?
I think it was just a tab that is open there.
There we go.
Yeah. Maybe.
It's only 2 minutes or so.
Los milicos invadieron mi cuerpo, se burlaron de mí, sus sucias manos tocaron mis piernas, mis brazos, mi estómago. Grité, pero no me escucharon. Grité tan fuerte que los cerros podían romperse. de las faldas mientras me iban rompiendo la blusa. Me quedé descubierta ante ellos y mi cuerpo de niña temblaba. Ellos tenían más fuerza que yo, por supuesto que sí, pero me defendí hasta el final. Con las uñas les jalé la piel, con los dientes les mordí la dignidad, les mordí la memoria, para que no se olvidaran de mí, de lo que me hacía, de lo que nos hacía. Mientras sus carcajadas venían una y otra dentro de mi cuerpo, y mis lágrimas lloraban en mi rostro. En ese preciso instante, recordé mi niñez. Recordé cuando corría por el campo y el viento jugaba con mis trenzas. Recordé cuando de niña jugaba con Laurita, que éramos palomas, y podíamos volar por encima de los cerros. Mi historia debe estar escrita porque no es solo mía. Es la historia de miles de palomas que volarán por el cielo celeste de la sierra. Esas palomas necesitan volar.
No queremos que se repitan 20 años de violencia. No queremos que nos quilen a nuestros hijos, que golpeen a nuestros hermanos, que violen a nuestras madres, que nos quiten poco a poco la felicidad. No, no queremos.
That's it. Thank you. Thank you very much for the talk, and thank you for sharing the video made by Marta. I think that is a very nice way to bring us a little bit closer to Lima. Yes, as I said, Connie Hoogwand will kick off the discussion. Maybe if you don't mind standing there for a moment so people can see and hear you a bit more clearly.
Stand or sit?
Would you prefer maybe to stand?
Okay.
Yeah.
That's good English.
Yeah.
Impacted by the video, probably you all are.
Yeah.
Very beautiful. And thank you for the talk. It was very, I think, interesting and very relevant, very important topic. And you gave us food for thought. So I will be kicking off the discussion here about, I think, the role of criminal justice indeed for bringing change. We think about gender-based violence in these contexts and in particular conflict. So your case is somewhat, what do we say, disappointing, or at least, I mean, yes, the Guatemala case brings so much hope, right, that there will be change, and then this case actually shows partly learning is difficult, or they don't want to listen, or what's happening. So I want to dig a bit deeper into what's actually happening, because I think that's interesting, and it's sort of also relates a bit to my own work and interests. So yes, international courts have been quite disappointed, although of course on paper it looks wonderful, right? If you look at all the legislation we have, it is actually hallmark, and it's a breakthrough, but then bringing that actually into practice is very difficult. And so it's very interesting indeed, I think, to look at what's happening at the domestic level, because of course if you bring it to the domestic level, yes, you're closer to the people, as you also point out, but of course you can also get mobilization. So yes, it would be interesting, and also to raise the awareness in society, because it's happening far away in some international courts. People often don't even know, right, that this is happening. And so I think indeed bringing it to the context and closer to the people. By the best way would be probably in the communities itself, right, like in Rwanda and so on. But then yeah. It's a good step forward, but then, as you point out, it's not so easy, right? And it's bringing some mobilizations we've seen in the video, but maybe not enough. So what is happening? Why is it so difficult? And so this I think this comparison is very interesting between the two countries. So what makes it then so difficult and so slow in Manta y Vilca? That was really what triggered me thinking about why this huge difference, right? And so, as you point out in the chapter, because you've been sending me the chapter before, it is there's no state will, you argue, or you call it willful neglect. But I would like to discuss go one step further. I think this is obstruction, and I think this is resistance, and I would be interested to know, to hear from you, should we understand this also in a broader context of resistance to gender equality, resistance to sexual and women's rights across the globe, but also particularly in Latin America, also in Peru, where we have the movement No Te Metas con Mis Hijos. So all these conservative forces that are also mobilizing and that are, so I work on Eastern Europe, Central Eastern Europe, capturing the state, right? So these conservative anti-gender equality and anti-LGBT forces are really capturing the state, like you see in Poland and Hungary. And so I'm really curious, are they capturing the state in Peru, and what are their inroads that actually in a court and so on? And so what are ways to deal with that and to resist that? That is one question. And I think it's also interesting because so far, if we think about this resistance against gender equality, and it has been mostly focused on reproductive rights and abortion, but we see also now that violence against women, which used to be a topic of international success, we think about feminist progress, is also now under threat, right? So I work on the Istanbul Convention, which is the Council of Europe convention that has now met with a lot of resistance. I'm not sure if this is also happening to the OAS Convention, which is a very important international legislation, obviously, and whether we also see resistance there. Yeah, I just and why is it now that these actors also turn against violence against women, and what is the agenda there? Another question I had about the role of the women's movements and feminist activists. You mentioned the role of the activist group Demos, but I was also interested in seeing also the video, what's the wider mobilization? Do we also see Menos kind of mobilization? How massive, do we see massive protest also against what's going on in these courts, and if not, why? And that brings me to the topic of race. Is it also then, are we dealing with intersectional difficulty that maybe because it is indigenous women that maybe it's not a high topic for feminist activists? I don't know, I just want to know. I have no clue. And what are indigenous movements and community doing? Are they mobilizing? So I'm curious to hear a little bit more about that context and then the mobilization around the domestic courts. And also, do they build coalitions? Do they manage to build coalitions, for instance, intersectional coalitions between indigenous movements and feminist activists? You mentioned in the start that international law is a bit on the background, right? That the International American Court didn't play a big role. They also conflicted it. But do they keep on? Do they play any continuing role? Because you also mentioned that obviously these women have very little resources, except for the civil society organization. But bringing them, in contrast to the Guatemala case, where there were resources, where there was help, where they were able to mobilize. So, is there any international support still, which I think is very important? And then my final question. So this has been, of course, a topic for feminist activism, like thinking of strategic litigation. These high-profile cases are so important, right? To indeed transform the context and to bring gender justice and to make these crimes really recognized. Are you still optimistic that this is indeed a way forward, and what would be necessary to do so? And then finally, I find it fascinating the role of art, and I think that's the project you're working on now, with commemoration. And So I would like to hear also a little bit more about how have these women responded to that kind of projects of art? What is can it be an alternative maybe to strategic litigation, particularly in times of resistance and this negative context against gender equality? So what are alternative ways if roads to justice are blocked, like we are seeing in Peru? So that would be my own point.
Okay, thank you so much, Connie. Very good questions. I think you could have another 40 minutes just kind of answering
but that's probably not the idea.
But we have time. You're spent a whole year here. So.
Yeah,
Exactly. No, excellent questions, really.
Very nice. I leave it to you, Jelke, whether to go through them rapidly or pick a few to expand a bit more on, but let's just also make sure that we have, after max 10 minutes when we open up to everyone, because I know there are other questions here as well.
Okay. So you let me talk really quickly. I'm good at that. There are a couple of very broad questions and a couple of very more pointed questions, and I certainly can't respond to all of it here and now. A couple of points that I'd like to pick up on is race, intersectionality is very important, of course. That I think that the support comes from civil society, including the arts-based mobilizations, come from a civil society that's much more middle class than the victim survivors are. Very clearly, these are Quechua-speaking, rural campesinas. There still is, unfortunately, a lot of stigma around sexual violence in these rural communities. So from within indigenous mobilizations, communities, women's organizations, even AMFASEP, which is the national organization for the disappeared, family members of the disappeared, which is a group of women from the highlands who have been looking for disappeared since the early 1980s. And they're very activist in everything related to human rights and to memory and so on. But sexual violence it's just not really on their agenda. And I'm pretty sure that the majority of them will have had experiences to that nature in the 1980s. But it's just really, really hard. It's just really, really hard. You see in a lot of the testimonies from women, the testimonies that they gave to the Truth Commission, for example, is where they tell about the violence that they experienced during the conflict and how they're still being abused by husbands and partners because they're seen as soiled by the military, or they're being called names. You're a soldier's wife. So it's not a theme that indigenous movements mobilize around for those reasons, but middle class elites do, particularly the younger generation of feminists is much more mixed. It's not necessarily white, and it used to be like that for the previous generation, but I think that is changing very much. But still, it's a different population. There are connections between, but no, as I said, it's really hard for these women. I feel that they're really isolated, and there's a large population who will not engage with this at all. Which is why it's so important. It could be so important if there is justice, and you could shout it from the roofs in all the provincial towns. That would make a major change because it shifted that stigma and the shame onto the perpetrators. So is this the way forward, criminal justice? Yes and no, of course. I think that sometimes the emphasis on criminal justice as what is going on the last 5 to 10 years, there's so much emphasis on criminal justice for sexual violence and conflict that it's too much, that it's also a burden on the victim survivors. It's a tremendous burden, as you see in this case, no? So is that worthwhile, or are there other ways? Arts is one thing, and I think arts is fantastic to question and unsettle in the public space, but that is not necessarily directed at or for the actual victim survivors and their communities. I think it's more broadly for wider societal awareness raising and not for those communities. And I think that that's probably true throughout Latin America and beyond. You know? But there might be are there other ways of repair? You know? So I think that, which is also why I found it necessary to explain those different pillars of transitional justice. I don't think that only criminal justice. The Sepur Zarco case is not changing the structures of Guatemalan society in such a way that it will reduce gender-based violence and femicide against young women in Guatemala. It won't, no, not on its own. But so you need all these interventions, including the arts, including memory, including truth, including comprehensive reparations for that might be financial or educational, healthcare. You know, decent healthcare would be something. Psychological support, and so on. So I think that none of these mobilizations are the solution by themselves, but we need to push back all the time from all those different angles. And that's true for, as you mentioned, for the conservative forces that are trying to take away a lot of women's rights and a lot of rights with regard to sexuality and sexual diversity. Yeah, it has to be resisted, and criminal justice might be one of those things. We see it in the US. If Texas is allowed to legislate against abortion, then you have to come back with also a legal strategy, which is what the Senate is now going to do. So it's all those different things. I really don't know, and I would like to think about that, about your question of, but why? I don't think that it's necessarily only conservative forces, although in the courts, particularly because it's in the footnotes of the article, because there's sometimes you can't fit everything in, where the couple of cases that I've studied of the files, the judicial files of cases that have been successful in Peru, those are smaller cases, hence not so exemplary, but there's a case of a woman who was repeatedly raped while in custody in the early 1990s, and she in the end did get some form of justice. And you see, for example, that I could trace the judges. So the judges in the two cases that had a sort of positive outcome were the same judges who were presiding over the other case that was positive. So the individual attitude of judges matters, which is why you need a specialized course and a specialized team, which is what has been watered down here. So that is a structural problem. You need people who have competence, in particular in crimes against humanity, you know, in international law, so that combination of international and domestic law can be applied. And so it could well be that these judges just don't have that background and don't have the time to read the amicus that was sent to them, because they're overwhelmed with petty crimes. No, I don't know. But so it's a part. It's resources. It's capacity, and it's also a lack of will, of course, a lack of importance given to these cases, and that has to do with with sexism, absolutely.
Thank you. Oh, like also thinking about